Good day, viewers, and welcome to a special interview here on NCN. I am Shukwan Gill, and for this discussion, we will be speaking extensively about the Ministry of Finance's mid-year report 2022. And for this discussion, I have the Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance, Dr. Ashni Singh, joining me. Dr. Singh, it is a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Shukwan. As always, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Definitely. Minister, let's jump right into what we're talking about. We're talking about the Ministry of Finance's mid-year report 2022, which shows a growth, rather, of 36.4%. How does this projection, and as a matter of fact, what we've seen in this report, compare to the projections that we had at the beginning of the year?
Sure. So, first of all, once again, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be here. And let me thank you for your interest in the mid-year report, which was published just a few days ago. I want to say at the onset that the preparation and publication of the mid-year report is an extremely important activity in the economic calendar and in the policy-making calendar of government. And it plays an extremely important role not only within government from the standpoint of giving us an opportunity to assess how the economy has been doing since the enactment of the budget, not only from the standpoint of updating our outlook and our projections for the rest of the year, but it's also a very important instrument and tool through which we are able to communicate with the world at large, international investors, domestic investors, the domestic private sector, and indeed all other actors and stakeholders in society on economic developments. And so it's also a very important tool or instrument in the whole architecture of transparent government, reporting periodically on economic performance, updating economic projections and financial projections and so on. You quite rightly pointed out that the most recent mid-year report, the report for 2022, reported the achievement of overall economic growth in real GDP of 36.4%, within which non-oil GDP grew by 8.3%. And we presented an updated projection for the rest of the year that anticipates that our economy will grow by 56% for the full year, and non-oil economic growth of 9.6%. Now, this represents an upward revision of our overall growth projection. At the time that we went to budget, we were projecting growth in the vicinity of about 46%, if I'm not mistaken. And so what we see now is an upward projection in our upward revision in our growth projection, our growth outlook for the rest of the year. This is a reflection of a number of developments. It's and I'm going to come back a little bit into what went into the updated projection. But let me say first of all that if we were to focus only on the first half year that has elapsed so far, on the whole, I would say that the economy has done incredibly well, considering the challenges that we've had to confront and the severity of the shocks that we've had to face as a country, and indeed as a country operating in an extremely vulnerable and fragile global setting. And so the fact that our economy has been able to withstand these shocks, and I can come back and speak a little bit about those if you'd like me to, the fact that we've been able to withstand these shocks and grow at the rate that we've been growing is most commendable. It's the achievement of the 36% growth in the first half of the year is reflective certainly of government's policy stance. As you know, we place the strongest level of importance, we attach the strongest level of importance as a government on the achievement of strong and sustainable economic growth. But it's also testimony to the efforts being made by the private sector to continue to invest and to expand, which they have been doing in response to the policy environment that we've created. So the outlook remains positive. I would say, in fact, the outlook is probably even more positive now than it was at the start of the year when we would have done the budget. A number of sectors are doing better than we had anticipated at the time of the budget. Oil and gas, for example, is doing well, doing indeed even better than we'd expected. And a number of other sectors are similarly doing even better than we'd expected. Others are facing some challenges, particularly those that have been more acutely affected by the extreme and erratic weather that we've been facing. Some of the subsectors within agriculture, for example, have been facing some challenges, particularly in terms of a timely recovery from the 2021 floods. But others, largely as a result of the support that we've provided to help food production get back on its feet. You see, for example, in the other crop sector, very strong growth in other crops. And that's reflective of the emphasis that we've placed on getting the other crop sector back up into production. And so I suppose the bottom line would be that the outlook remains very positive for Guyana. Our growth, the updated growth projection of 56% for 2022 represents an upward revision of what we had initially anticipated at the time of the budget. And if I might say so, very importantly, this outlook is, of course, reflective of the incredibly exciting things that are happening in oil and gas. But very, very importantly, and I want to emphasize this, the outlook for the rest of the year also reflects a very strong picture in relation to the non-oil economy, which is extremely important for us because, first of all, from the standpoint of any resource-based economy, it's important to have a strong non-resource sector. It's important from the standpoint of economic diversification. And secondly, as a government, we've placed a lot of policy emphasis on ensuring economic diversification. And so the continued strength of the non-oil economy is, in fact, something that we are pleased to observe, and it represents, I believe, a vindication of the emphasis that we've placed on ensuring economic diversification and a strong non-oil economy.
Minister, permit me to ask, in relation to the oil and gas sector, how much of the massive 36.4% that we've seen, how much of that is attributed to the burgeoning oil and gas sector?
Sure. So oil itself has recorded very strong growth, as you've seen in the report. So simply the value added created by the oil and gas sector itself, that is to say, the growth in its production, that on its own is, of course, a significant contributor to overall growth. But of course, oil and gas also feeds into the economy through multiple other channels. And so you have the growth in the oil and gas sector driving support services for the oil and gas industry. So, for example, you have a number of new companies that are setting up that are providing support to oil and gas. You've seen many of them, whether it is on shore-based facilities, onshore supply services, transport and logistics, warehousing, retail and distribution, food production. There's a lot of activity that would constitute what I would call positive spillovers from the oil and gas sector, economic activity that is generated as a result of or related to the expansion that we're seeing in the oil and gas sector. But in addition to that, like I said, we've seen very strong, we've seen 8.3% growth in the non-oil economy in the first half. We're projecting 9.6% economic non-oil growth for the full year. We are seeing very strong underlying growth in the non-oil sectors, in the various productive subsectors of the non-oil sector. So to give you an example of some of the sectors that we're seeing, that we have placed strong policy emphasis on, agriculture, for example. And here I'm speaking not just about traditional agriculture. Sugar and rice have always been important, but we, even within agriculture, we have said we would like to diversify away from the traditional crops. We recognize the inherent vulnerability that arises from being too heavily dependent on one or two crops or one or two products, outputs. We want to make sure that we diversify away, so we have a widely even within agriculture, that we have a widely diversified agricultural base. And so we're emphasizing, as you know, things like corn, soybean, tropical varieties of wheat, with a view to large-scale cultivation. We are promoting, for example, other crops or non-traditional crops, or what's called in some places cash crops, fruits, vegetables, etc. We're also promoting very heavily livestock. You would have work that we're doing with the Black Giant Project, the sheep, the project, the Black Belly Sheep Project with Barbados, the aquaculture and the fish farming and shrimp farming, all of which constitute efforts to diversify even within agriculture. Agriculture is going to continue to be important and will be increasingly important going forward, but we want to make sure that even within agriculture there's diversification. You have seen, for example, in the non-oil extractive sector, so here I'm speaking about things like mining and quarrying, not oil, mining and quarrying. Gold, of course, continues to be an extremely important sector in the economy. The gold industry did have some challenges in the first half, a lot of which was related, curiously, to weather. People associate weather with agriculture. They don't associate necessarily directly. It's not obvious that weather has an impact on mining, but particularly where your mining takes place in the hinterland and where access to the hinterland is so important, you need to get heavy equipment into the hinterland. The rains have really been battering our hinterland-based industries. Both mining and forestry have had to grapple with the reality that accessibility has continued to be a very severe challenge. And so gold the sector has done decently, but it has had some challenges largely because of accessibility issues. But it continues to be a sector that we place a lot of emphasis on. And had we not implemented the policy measures that we've implemented, the sector, in fact, would have faced even greater challenges. So, for example, as you know, we have done a lot of work to support the mining sector. We, for example, took off the taxes on fuel, gasoline and diesel. Diesel, of course, is a critical input into the mining industry. We revisited the tax regime, the tributous tax and the final tax that is applicable to the mining sector. As you know, we recently enacted legislation there. We've been investing heavily in hinterland roads, specifically recognizing how critical accessibility is for our hinterland-based industries. So we've ramped up significantly our investment in hinterland roads. So all of those measures have helped to cushion the impact of otherwise adverse conditions, particularly in relation to accessibility and weather on the gold mining sector. But going forward, we continue to promote both large-scale mining. There are a number of companies, as you know, who are looking at possible large-scale developments. We continue to support the small and medium-scale mining sector as much as we can, including by the measures that I just announced. We are encouraging, as you know, we became a manganese exporter for the first time in 60 years this year. Manganese has now entered the productive productive base for the first time in 60 years. There are other subsectors within mining and quarrying that have actually been doing well. There's very strong demand for quarry products. So quarry production, we anticipate that quarry production is going to pick up significantly going forward because there are a number of new quarries that are expected to come on stream. And there's very strong demand for quarry stone, particularly given the construction boom that we're seeing. And sand production has been doing very well, also as a result of the construction boom that we've been seeing, both on the public sector and the public infrastructure side and the private sector side. So mining and quarrying continues to be important. Agriculture, I spoke about earlier. Services on the whole, construction, I should say, is in fact an extremely important sector. There's been a rapid upsurge in construction, both on the PSIP side, the Public Sector Investment Program. As you know, we're rolling out an unprecedented program to expand our transport infrastructure. New roads are being built, roads are being upgraded, bridges are being built, entire new communities are being opened up, new housing areas are being opened up with new roads and other supportive infrastructure being laid down. And then on the private side, there's been a tremendous private response to that those conditions that we've put in place, that policy environment that we've put in place. And so you're seeing a tremendous upsurge in private construction. You have things like, at every end of the spectrum, you have large-scale construction, like people building out ports and wharves and shore-based facilities. You know, there's a new port facility being built in West Demerara, the mouth of the Demerara River on the western side. You have a number of companies building out large warehouses and storage and processing facilities. And then you have more at the household than at the industrial and commercial end. You also have, I should have mentioned, in the middle there, you have also hotels, several brand new hotels being built. And then at the household, more at the micro level, you have an unprecedented number of households building homes for the first time as a result of the housing program that we've rolled out, and responding to the reduced cost of borrowing, which came about as a result of the policy interventions that we implemented, things like increasing the ceiling for the low-income housing window at the banks, increasing the ceiling for loans at NBS, the New Building Society. And so you've got a tremendous upsurge in private construction as well at all ends of the spectrum, industrial and commercial, but also household. So construction has been doing very well. And then all of the services, we've seen a good, strong, solid recovery from the very difficult performance and the very difficult conditions in 2020. Things like accommodation and services like, the services that are traditionally associated with the tourism and hospitality sector, things like restaurants, etc., now fully open, operating again at full capacity. Retail, wholesale and retail and transport and distribution and communication, they're all doing very well. Again, reflecting the renewed economic activity and unprecedented level of private sector confidence, consumer confidence as well. And so across the entire services spectrum, we've seen tremendous growth, which is also, of course, incredibly exciting. So to come back to the questions you ask, oil and gas certainly is, as you've seen from the headline numbers, oil and gas is certainly contributing significantly to overall growth. But we are actually recording very strong non-oil growth as well. And that non-oil growth is very broadly diversified and certainly not concentrated amongst what would have been regarded as historically the traditional sectors of our economy. And that's good, because what it means is we're seeing new and emerging sectors coming to the fore and occupying a place in the economy that they didn't previously occupy, which is something that we welcome. We want the traditional sectors to do well, and we're going to continue to support them and work with them to make sure that they do well. But we welcome the emergence of new sectors of the economy. I mean, I didn't mention the things like ICT sector. As you know, the president liberalized the telecommunications sector when he came into one of the first things that he did when he came into government. We are seeing rapid investment in new business process outsourcing centers, new call centers, tremendous upsurge in employment in that sector. That's something that I'm going to speak on at another occasion. But all of that generates economic activity to all of those things, new call centers opening up, new people being employed, disposable income being used in the shops and the markets and so on. So altogether, I would say that, we're seeing very strong underlying non-oil growth. We're seeing obviously very strong overall growth, which incorporates our oil activity in the oil sector. And of course, oil is important. There's absolutely no, denying that, no doubt about that. When our first FPSO was producing, it had a capacity of 120,000 barrels a day. That's now operating at full capacity. We have a second FPSO now operating at 220,000 barrels a day. So we have capacity now of in the order of about 340, 350,000 barrels a day. And they're both operating pretty much in the range of their full capacity, which is excellent news. And so you're going to see this year you're going to see more than 100% growth in the oil sector.
So let me ask you, Dr. Singh, the report also projects that we're going to get just about US $1.1 billion from the sale of the country's share of oil, with roughly 140 US million in terms of royalties. Yeah. How is this going to be achieved? And while you're at that, why is there this accelerated approach in terms of the extraction of oil?
Well, let me say this, that there are two variables essentially that go into that. So there are two drivers. One is volume and the other is price. And you're seeing a volume effect for sure, because we are in fact producing more oil than we'd anticipated, because we got up to full capacity. We brought on stream the second FPSO. We've been able to the sector has been able to get both FPSOs to operate at an optimal level. And so you're seeing a significant volume effect in the first instance. So what you have is, you have more than a doubling of our productive capacity. Right. Last year, for almost all of last year, we pretty much had capacity to produce 120,000 barrels of oil a day, like I said earlier. We now have the capacity to produce almost 350,000 barrels a day. So you have a volume effect, first and foremost. Then you have a price effect. We've seen what has happened to the world market price for oil. Some of that is driven by the developments in Europe, the war in Ukraine. We saw the oil prices spike almost to 100 and got up to almost as high as $140 a barrel, which is about $136 or $138 a barrel, which is the highest oil price that we would have seen in a long time. It's reverted a little bit now, but it's still relatively high compared to where it was a year ago or thereabouts. And so you've got a price effect as well. So the value of the oil that we produce, and therefore the value of our profit share, is a function of both volume and price. And that gives the value. So the updated projection of $1.1 billion of profit oil, and I think just about 150 or just under 150 million, 1.1 billion of profit oil and just under 150 million of royalties. That reflects both volume and price, the value that will be produced. You asked the question about, and I should add that the ramping up of volume reflects our production plans, reflects the plans. As you know, we've already announced publicly, the operator of the Stabroek block has already announced publicly, jointly with the government, we've already announced publicly what our anticipated ramping up trajectory, production trajectory is going to be in relation to the third and fourth FPSOs, which are already under construction. You've seen public report. We've launched publicly. We all participated in the public launching of the third FPSO and fourth FPSO. So there's been a, there's, I think, a fairly widely known and publicly disclosed path over which our production will evolve. I mean, we've said publicly that with the third FPSO coming on stream, we're going to have the capacity to produce more than 500,000 barrels a day. And we've said publicly that we anticipate by the end of the decade, we're going to be producing in the vicinity of about 1 million barrels a day. That's been said publicly. And so this ramping up of production is very much in keeping with the plans that we've outlined and reflects the achievement of those plans as government and plans on the part of the operator. And is consistent with our government's position, which of course is to ensure that we maximize production in the interest of growing the economy and generating the maximum possible revenue for the people of Guyana.
Minister, we've spoken about the massive earnings that Guyana is expected to receive from that oil and gas sector. And I must ask you, there's been a public notion, per se, that for some reason there are citizens that say that the finance that comes from the oil and gas sector is not trickling down, per se, to the ordinary man. What policies, from a fiscal perspective too, what policies has government implemented so far to deal with, ensuring that everybody is able to benefit from the oil and gas earnings?
Absolutely. Well, let me say this. There are multiple examples that I can give, or I can answer. I can present to you multiple channels through which what's happening in the oil and gas sector is generating benefit for the people of Guyana. And I'm going to mention just a few. But first of all, I want to speak about what we have done as a government to ensure that the people of Guyana can benefit, and all of the people of Guyana can benefit. First and foremost, we've put in place a legal framework that was not in place before to ensure that the presence and expansion of the oil and gas sector generates opportunity for Guyanese people. What do I mean by this? We took to Parliament at the end of last year, for the first time ever, local content legislation. Previously, there was no local content legislation, and notwithstanding that we had been producing oil since, well, we had found oil since 2015, and we'd been producing oil since 2019. So the confirmation of the discovery of oil dates back to May 2015. As you know, the API and UAFC assumed office in May 2015. And one would have expected that in the normal course of things, the institutional prerequisites for an oil and gas sector would have been legal, and institutional prerequisites would have been put in place. 5 years later, we came into office and there was no local content legislation. We put local content legislation in place in December 2021. And I'm going to come back in a minute to why that matters. We put in place an updated NRF, Natural Resources Fund Act, to ensure greater transparency and accountability in the management of our oil revenues and of our oil resources, the proceeds of our oil sector. We put in place a strengthened governance structure for that sector, including, as you know, a new board of directors where there wasn't a board of directors previously, enhanced transparency surrounding the sector, the requirement that receipts be published, etc. So, and each one of these I could go back to and elaborate in detail. But let me just say, we put in place a dramatically stronger legal framework to ensure both stronger management of our oil revenues, the proceeds of the oil sector, and secondly, a legal framework where one did not exist previously to ensure local content, minimum local content is achieved. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have started to put in place the institutional mechanisms to operationalize these. So Budget 2022 is the first budget that utilizes, to finance the budget, utilizes proceeds from the oil and gas sector. So Budget 2022 is historic in many ways because for the very first time, oil revenues constitute a part of budgetary financing. And in this particular case, Budget 2022 includes a projected transfer of $607 million to the consolidated fund, intact from the Natural Resources Fund to the consolidated fund, in a completely transparent manner, reflected in detail in the budget documents to finance projects, programs, and initiatives that are outlined in the budget. And I will come back again to that and give you a few examples of those. And still on the subject of institutional prerequisites, we have set up the local content secretariat, we have set up the local content register, and a number of companies are already starting to benefit. Now, in order to meet the local content requirements, the operator and their contractors, their first tier 1 contractors, have to meet certain minimum thresholds in relation to equity participation by Guyanese, supply of goods and services by Guyanese companies, senior management positions to be held by Guyanese, and employment, minimum levels of employment by Guyanese. And you might be surprised to know how many of these companies are already creating opportunities for Guyanese people. I visited one of the largest global services companies, a company that operates around the world, providing services to ExxonMobil. Not only ExxonMobil, to big oil companies, oil majors all around the world. I visited their operations a few months ago. It was publicly reported. They have nearly 200 young Guyanese people working there, undergoing world-class training, performing absolutely impressive technical tasks, and earning an income from working in a world-class operation. They could be, I mean, these are people who could, with the skills that they're acquiring now, they could be working anywhere in the world. They're being trained, they have been trained, they're now working. I think there are about 180 of them working in that one company only. That's only one example. This is Schlumberger, I can say it publicly. I think it was publicly reported that I visited them. So, and they are planning to ramp up their operations further. And the same is being replicated across the board. There are Guyanese people now working in the sector. You saw, for example, just 2 days ago, the launching of a new $20 million privately owned training facility for the oil and gas sector. I had the privilege of visiting that facility before they did the public launching. They have already been training people, and they said to me that they had trained a batch of about 26 persons. The entire batch of 26 was recruited immediately by companies that do work for the operator of the Stabroek Block, for ExxonMobil. These people already have jobs, they're earning incomes. So first, if in relation to the question that you ask about ensuring, some of the things that we've done to ensure that Guyanese people benefit, first of all, like I said, we've put the legal frameworks in place. Secondly, we have operationalized those legal frameworks by putting in place the institutional prerequisites in place. Thirdly, we have actively facilitated and encouraged private companies to create opportunities for Guyanese people. So the mere fact that we've ensured that these companies have come, that they've established their operations, we have facilitated the expansion of their operations and supported it where we can, in order to ensure that they can recruit Guyanese people. You would be surprised at how many young Guyanese people are working now in this sector, acquiring skills that will make them equal to you know, the best globally. You know, I was so, every time I visit one of these companies, I'm so incredibly proud when I see what our young Guyanese people are doing, trained in local institutions. These are graduates of the University of Guyana, graduates of the Government Technical Institute or one of the other technical institutes across the country, doing world-class work. It fills me with pride to see young Guyanese people, you know, playing that role. In addition to that, we have committed and we've already started rolling out accelerated training programs to make sure that, and these are obviously financed out of the budget, publicly financed training programs to make sure that even more Guyanese people can take up those roles. So, for example, we've put in the budget this year an allocation, and we've already started work to develop the Guyana Technical Training College in Port Morant, which is going to include the old Gaisuko Training School, it's going to include the National Oil and Gas Institute, and it will include the Tourism and Hospitality Institute. The National Oil and Gas Institute is being developed in partnership with ExxonMobil at that location. That facility is going to be training hundreds of Guyanese people who will move straight from that facility into the oil and gas sector. And we're already working on establishing that facility. And if you think about it, there is no better way to ensure that people are able to participate in the oil and gas sector than by ensuring that they have skills to be able to take up gainful and fulfilling and rewarding employment and be able to launch a career themselves, embark on a career themselves in the oil and gas sector. And so we're putting in place, we're doing all of this training, we're investing heavily in training. I mean, take, for example, when we invest in the Gold Scholarship Program, and we say we want to make sure that Guyanese people across the country, not only those who live near to Turkine and those who live near to Tain, but Guyanese people throughout the country are able to get access to higher education, university-level education, or specialized technical training. We're not doing that because getting a university-type training is an end in its own right. We want to make sure that every Guyanese person who is of the age and inclination to pursue higher education is able to do so in order to participate in the new economy and the new economic opportunities that are emerging. So these people are acquiring new skills, the beneficiaries of the Gold Scholarship Program, they're acquiring new skills which will increase their own value in the labor market, in the economy of tomorrow. That's an example of how people are benefiting. Similarly, we're investing in education more broadly. You've seen what we've been investing heavily in ensuring universal secondary education as a feeder into tertiary education, investing heavily in technical and vocational education. All of those are channels through which Guyanese people are benefiting. And then, of course, we have tried to strengthen the social safety nets that we've been providing. And in particular the support that we've been providing to vulnerable vulnerable sections of the population. We recognize that a lot of people were terribly affected by the floods last year. You know, we've been providing some immediate relief to help people to get back up on their feet, to resume production and productive activity. We've resumed the cash grant, and we've rapidly increased the cash grant from when we came into office. The cash grant, this is the cash grant to persons of school age. Now we've increased the cash grant this year to $30,000 per student, per child going to school, and we've expanded it to include private schools as well. That's another example of an investment that we're making, not just, the cash grant to encourage people to go to school shouldn't be seen as, just a standalone initiative. It's an investment in ensuring that every single young Guyanese person today must be able to get a decent education. Yeah. And we want them to get a decent education, not just because a decent education is a beautiful thing or something worth talking about. We want every single young Guyanese person to get a decent education so that they can get a good job, or so that they can participate meaningfully in the economy going forward. And I maintain, and our government maintains, there's no more important investment that we can make as a government than investment in the education of our young people. And so there are multiple, like I said, multiple channels through which people have benefited. And I mean, if you take, for example, the local content legislation, there are a lot of companies now, increasingly Guyanese companies, who are supplying, if they're not supplying Exxon directly, they're supplying Exxon Tier 1 contractors, they're providing goods and services, they're employing people, they're employing more people, they're able to pay more, pay incomes to their employees. That is a quiet that's a development that is taking place quietly, and it's gaining momentum. Mm-hmm. You know, you'd be surprised at some of the sectors that are providing services to ExxonMobil, and it's happening quietly, and indeed it's happening rapidly. And then, of course, outside of oil and gas, there's similar developments taking place in other sectors that, you know, we've been showcasing, but, you know, speaking about, but I don't know how much public consciousness there is. I mean, a favorite of mine is, of course, the BPO sector, the call centers, because, you know, this is a sector that employs a lot of people. Mm-hmm. You know, this is a sector, when we came into government, the sector probably employed maybe just under 1,500 persons or thereabouts. Today, that sector employs almost 5,000 persons, and growing. You know, you've seen some of these are global companies. You've seen job fairs being hosted. Teleperformance hosted a job fair in Berbice recently. I was there. ITEL, I think, hosted a job fair just the other day. I believe they hosted a job fair in Georgetown on Saturday. We have a new call center operating in Linden, owned by a Guyanese entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. They've created probably about 150 jobs, and they're looking to ramp up to about 250 jobs once they get up to peak. These are all things that these are all the result of investments being made by government in order to ensure that the economic well-being of our people is improved, in order to ensure that Guyanese people are able to acquire skills and are able to get jobs and are able to achieve economic independence.
Dr. Singh, as we conclude our conversation about the mid-year report 2022, a bit earlier in the year there was a massive conversation surrounding the inflation rate, or the projected inflation rate. So for the mid-year, where we are now, tell us a little bit about how government has been able to manage that inflation, sure, especially considering what is happening globally.
I'm absolutely glad that you mentioned that, because it's obviously an important issue. Mm-hmm. Cost of living goes to the core of people's well-being. And it's an issue that, you know, has affected the entire world, and Guyana has certainly not been immune from it. I'm also glad that you mentioned it, because it's important to understand that the growth that we've achieved was achieved in the face, mm-hmm, of very severe challenges. Not only COVID-19, not only the war in Ukraine, but the impact that those developments had on things like the global supply chain, with the cost of freight going up dramatically, the cost of oil going up dramatically, the cost of certain food products going up dramatically, like wheat, etc., because, of course, between Russia and Ukraine, they produce quite a lot of oil, they produce quite a lot of wheat, etc. So you've had, and then, of course, with the lockdowns in China, with China's zero COVID policy, you know, that has also impacted on the global logistics network and the global and indeed on global production. So the reality is that there's a very harsh global environment in relation to production and prices. And the reality is that as a small price-taking economy, which is what Guyana is, some of that, of course, has fed into the Guyanese economy. You know, we're just like everybody else. We're buying oil at world market prices. We're buying construction materials, steel and others at world market, cement and others at world market prices. We're buying wheat at world market prices. And so it's unavoidable that some of this in global inflationary pressures have been imported. We recognize this as a government, and we want to make sure that we cushion the impact as far as we possibly can cushion the impact of these imported inflationary pressures on the domestic population. So what are some of the things that we've done? First of all, fuel prices affect everything: cost of transportation, cost of production, because in mining, in agriculture, in every aspect of activity, people use fuel. In fishing, people use fuel, etc. We moved, from the time we came into government, we reduced fuel price, the taxes on fuel from 50 to 35%, then from 35 to 20, then from 20 to 10, and then from 10 to 0. To the point now where we're at, where we have completely removed excise taxes on fuel. What that has enabled is it has enabled the impact of the imported escalation in fuel prices to be cushioned. So in other words, the full impact is no longer felt because the government is not collecting any taxes on fuel anymore. So that's one. Secondly, what else affects the price of all imports? Freight. And freight costs, whereas a container from China used to cost maybe $3,000 a year or two ago, it now costs in the order of $18,000 to $20,000. It went up as high as that. Just a few months ago, it would cost you like $18,000 to get a container landed in Guyana. And this has had a devastating impact. I've had members of the private sector say to me that sometimes the cost of shipping the container is more expensive than the cost of the items in the container. I've had the private sector, as you know, we maintain a close engagement with the private sector through the Private Sector Commission and the other umbrella bodies. I've had many members of the private sector say to me that sometimes they bring a container, and the cost of the goods in the container is less than the cost to ship the container and land it in Guyana. So we implemented an initiative whereby we put a cap on the cost of freight that is used for the purposes of determining the CIF value, for the purposes of calculating import taxes. So the taxes are calculated on the CIF value, the cost of landing the goods in Guyana. So that includes not just the cost of the goods, but the cost of the freight to get the goods in Guyana. We didn't want the heightened cost of the freight to affect the taxable value of the goods. So what we did was we said we're going to set the freight cost that we will assume for the purposes of calculating the landed CIF value. We're going to cap that at the pre-pandemic levels. So that alone pumped billions of dollars, I shouldn't say pumped billions of dollars back into the private sector, but it freed up the private sector of having to pay billions of dollars of what would have been additional taxes on the CIF value. Thirdly, we removed taxes on a wide range of items. We took the VAT off of almost all basic food items, and we took the VAT off almost all basic construction materials, cement and others. Here again, recognizing that a lot of young Guyanese families, young and not so young Guyanese families, want to become homeowners. We don't want home ownership to be out beyond their reach. A lot of people, their single largest outlay is either rent, the cost of their housing. Cost of your housing is often your single largest outlay, the cost of your rent or what you're paying for your mortgage. We want that to be kept under control. So we removed the taxes, the VAT on construction materials to keep the cost of housing down, and we removed the VAT on basic food items. Of course, we also removed the VAT on a number of other items that the AP and UAFC had put VAT on: electricity, water, etc. We also reversed some of the increases that they had put on things like land rents, etc. So that alone reduced freed up some amount of cash flow for the farmers, reducing the cost of production of agricultural produce. Thirdly or fourthly, notwithstanding that fuel prices have moved from $40 a barrel to almost $140 a barrel, like I said before, they subsided a little bit. But notwithstanding that fuel prices moved essentially from $40 a barrel to maybe between $100 and $120 a barrel, we have not adjusted electricity tariffs, and we have not adjusted water tariffs. We have said we will absorb the impact. Obviously, GPL and GWI are buying fuel on the world market at these increased prices. And in order to cover the cost of their fuel is the single biggest input into electricity generation. You can imagine if fuel prices have tripled,
right,
what would have happened to the cost, what has happened to the cost of producing electricity. We have said we will absorb that. We're not going to increase the electricity tariff. We will absorb it. We said the same with respect to water tariffs. Had we passed through the cost of increased fuel prices on electricity and water, there had been a dramatic impact on the tariffs that are paid by people and ultimately on disposable income. You would have seen, for example, in the United Kingdom has just elected a new Prime Minister this morning. One of the hottest topics was the cost of energy. And in that whole leadership contest, that was one of the hottest topics. And one of the critical policy issues, what will the new Prime Minister do about energy costs? Because households, even in the United Kingdom, are feeling the pinch of increased energy costs as a result of increased fuel prices. So we have said we're going to cap those. Food is an absolute, obviously after cost of housing, food is and transportation, food is probably right up there in terms of the largest and most important outlays at a household consumption level. We have ramped up food production. We've invested heavily in food production to ensure that food remains readily available in good quantities so that there are no food shortages, and so that these shortages cannot result in cannot result in price escalation. Hence the growth that you've seen in the other crop sector, and hence the continued policy emphasis that you have seen us and that you will continue to see us placing on ensuring adequate availability of food and of all food products. And that's something we're going to continue to do. Those are just some examples. I know we're probably under pressure for time, but those are just some examples of some of the things that we've done. As a result of which, yes, we have come under some inflationary pressure, just like the rest of the world. Happily, we've been able to contain inflation to just about 4.9% in the first half of the year. That's still higher than where we would like it to be. And we understand how important this issue is to the people of Guyana, as it is indeed to people all around the world. I've given you a number of examples of things that we have done proactively to contain the impact, and we're going to continue. We also, of course, I didn't mention, but we also, of course, put a special allocation in the budget, an allocation of a $5 billion for special cost of living measures. Mm-hmm. One of those goes straight to the core of reducing the cost of producing food. Mm-hmm. Out of that $5 billion, we took $1 billion specially to target the more affordable availability of fertilizers for the agricultural sector. So $1 billion went to that. Another $800 million went to provide special cash grants to households in riverine and hinterland communities, recognizing how acutely these communities were affected, because of course they're further away. Transportation cost affects them very heavily. They don't have ready access to the main municipal markets in the same way that people living in the major urban centers do, etc. So those are just some examples, but it's an issue that's extremely important, and I'm glad that you mentioned it. And like I said, I gave a few examples of some of the things that we're doing as a government, and we're going to continue to do more of the same to ensure that the people of Guyana are protected as far as we possibly can from the impact of cost of living increases. But ultimately, the most important thing, the priority for us, is to ensure that as many Guyanese people as possible are equipped and are able to participate in the incredibly exciting transformation that beckons our country.
Dr. Singh, I want to thank you for taking the time to have this discussion here with me on the Mid-Year Report 2022. This has been a special conversation here with Dr. Singh, Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance. I'm your host, Shaquan Gill, saying bye for now.
Thank you very much, Shaquan. Very good.